My stepfather tried to sell my deceased mother's house without my knowledge. The title company investigation revealed his fraud. I never thought I'd be writing this story, but here we are 3 years later and I'm still processing everything that happened. My mom passed away when I was 26, and it completely shattered my world in ways I never imagined possible. She had been battling cancer for 2 years, and even though we knew the end was coming, nothing really prepares you for that moment when the person who raised you just isn't there anymore. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles, but what I remember most clearly was how my stepfather seemed almost relieved rather than devastated. He'd been married to my mom for 8 years, and while their relationship had its ups and downs, I always assumed he genuinely cared about her. Looking back now, I realize there were signs I should have picked up on, but grief has a way of making you blind to things that should be obvious. My mom had always been incredibly organized about her finances and legal documents, something she'd learned from her own mother, who went through a messy estate battle decades earlier. She kept everything in a fireproof safe in her bedroom closet, and she'd shown me where it was multiple times over the years. The combination was my birthday plus her birthday, which she thought was sweet and easy to remember. She'd always told me that if anything happened to her, I needed to get those documents immediately and make sure everything was handled properly. The week after the funeral, I finally worked up the courage to go through her things. My stepfather had been staying at his brother's house, claiming he couldn't bear to be in the house where she'd spent her final months. I understood that completely, so I didn't think anything of it when he said he needed some space to process everything. I went over to the house on a Tuesday morning, expecting to find everything just as she'd left it. The safe was empty. Not just the important documents, but everything. Her jewelry, the cash she kept for emergencies, even the old photographs she'd stored in there from when I was little. I stood there staring at the empty metal box for probably 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was that maybe she'd moved everything before she died, but that didn't make sense because she'd mentioned the safe just a few weeks before she passed. I called my stepfather immediately, and his response was strange. He didn't seem surprised that the safe was empty, and he kept saying that my mom had asked him to handle all the paperwork and legal stuff because she didn't want to burden me with it during such a difficult time. That sounded like something she might do, but it also felt off somehow. She'd always been very specific about wanting me to be involved in handling her affairs, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wanted to make sure I understood how everything worked. Over the next few days, I kept asking him about the documents and when we'd need to go through them together. He kept putting me off, saying he was still organizing everything and that we'd sit down soon to go through it all. But soon never came. Every time I brought it up, he had some excuse about why it wasn't a good time or why he needed to handle something else first. After 2 weeks of this, I started to get suspicious. The breaking point came when I drove past my mom's house on a Saturday afternoon and saw a real estate sign in the front yard. Not just any sign, but one of those bright orange ones that says "Sold" across the top. I pulled over and sat there staring at it, feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. My mom had specifically told me that she wanted me to have the house, and we'd talked about how I might want to live there someday or at least keep it in the family. I marched up to the front door and used my key to get in, but the locks had been changed. I stood there on the porch, fumbling with a key that no longer worked, feeling more confused and angry than I'd ever felt in my life. I called my stepfather immediately, and this time I didn't beat around the bush. I demanded to know what was going on with the house and why there was a sold sign in the yard. His explanation was elaborate and smooth, which should have been another red flag. He said that my mom had huge medical bills that needed to be paid, and that selling the house was the only way to cover them. He claimed that she'd discussed this with him before she died, and had asked him to handle everything quietly so I wouldn't have to worry about the financial burden. He said the proceeds from the sale would go into an account that would eventually be mine, but that it might take some time to sort through all the medical debt first. Part of me wanted to believe him because the alternative was too awful to consider. But another part of me, the part that sounded exactly like my mom's voice in my head, was telling me that something was very wrong. My mom had good insurance, and while there were some out-of-pocket expenses, they weren't anywhere near enough to require selling the house. Plus, she'd been very clear about wanting me to inherit the property. I decided to do some investigating on my own. I started by calling the hospital where she'd received most of her treatment, pretending I needed to understand the billing situation for estate purposes. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The total outstanding medical bills were less than $8,000. Significant, but not even close to requiring the sale of a house worth over $300,000. Next, I went to the county recorder's office to look up the deed information for the house. This is where things got really interesting. According to the records, my mom had indeed left the house to me in her will, but there was also a quitclaim deed dated just 2 weeks before she died that transferred the property to my stepfather. The signature looked like hers, but something about it seemed off. The handwriting was shakier than usual, which could have been explained by her illness, but there were subtle differences that bothered me. I took copies of everything and went to see the attorney who had helped my mom set up her will a few years earlier. He was shocked when I showed him the quitclaim deed, because he said my mom had never mentioned wanting to change the house inheritance. In fact, he said she'd been very specific about wanting me to have the property, and had even discussed setting up a trust to make sure it passed to me cleanly. The attorney suggested that I contact the title company that had handled the sale to see if they'd done their due diligence on the property transfer. This turned out to be the key that unlocked the whole mess. The title company had apparently been somewhat concerned about the timing of the quitclaim deed so close to the property owner's death, but they'd been assured by my stepfather that everything was legitimate and that I was aware of the sale. When I contacted them and explained that I had not been aware of the sale and that I was supposed to inherit the property, they immediately put a hold on the transaction. The buyers were understandably upset, but the title company was more concerned about potential legal liability if they'd facilitated the sale of property that had been fraudulently transferred. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what my stepfather had done. The quitclaim deed was indeed forged. He'd practiced my mom's signature for weeks, using old documents from the safe to get the handwriting right. He'd even gone so far as to have the document notarized by someone he knew who didn't ask too many questions about whether the signature was authentic. But the really twisted part was that he'd planned this while my mom was still alive. The timeline showed that he'd started the process of transferring the property to himself almost a month before she died, when she was heavily sedated and barely conscious most of the time. He'd waited until she was too weak to know what was happening, then forged her signature on the deed transfer. The title company's investigation also revealed that this wasn't his first time doing something like this. He'd been involved in a similar situation with his previous wife's estate, though that case had been settled out of court. Apparently, this was basically his method of operation. He'd marry older women with assets, then find ways to transfer their property to himself before or after they died. The discovery process was emotionally devastating. Finding out that someone I'd trusted, someone who'd been part of my family for 8 years, had been systematically planning to steal from my mom while she was dying was almost more than I could handle. I'd already been dealing with the grief of losing her, and now I had to face the fact that her husband had been betraying her even in her final days. The legal battle that followed was complicated and expensive. My stepfather had already received a significant portion of the money from the sale, and he'd spent a good chunk of it on things that would be difficult to recover. He'd bought a new truck, paid off his credit cards, and even taken a vacation to Las Vegas. The idea that he'd been celebrating his fraud while I was still mourning my mom was sickening. The criminal charges were filed pretty quickly once the authorities got involved. Forgery, fraud, and elder abuse were the main charges, though there were several other smaller ones related to the specifics of what he'd done. The elder abuse charge was particularly serious because my mom had been in a vulnerable state when he'd forged her signature, and there were laws specifically designed to protect people in that situation. What surprised me most was how the community reacted when the story got out. I'd expected some people to be skeptical or to think that maybe there was more to the story than what I was telling. Instead, I found incredible support from people who'd known my mom and who were outraged that someone had taken advantage of her when she was dying. The neighbor who lived next door to my mom's house came forward with information that proved crucial to the case. She'd seen my stepfather going through my mom's things and loading boxes into his truck several times during the weeks before my mom died. At the time, she'd assumed he was just organizing things or maybe donating items my mom no longer needed. But in retrospect, she realized he'd been systematically removing anything valuable from the house. The trial was emotionally brutal. Having to sit in a courtroom and listen to the details of how my stepfather had betrayed my mom while she was dying was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. But it was also validating in a way, because it confirmed that my instincts had been right and that I hadn't been paranoid or suspicious for no reason. The prosecution's case was solid, But my stepfather's defense attorney tried to paint him as someone who'd been overwhelmed by grief and had made poor decisions without malicious intent. They argued that my mom had verbally agreed to the property transfer, and that the forged signature was just a way to formalize something she'd already approved. It was a creative defense, but it didn't hold up under scrutiny. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. The judge was particularly harsh in sentencing because of the elder abuse aspect, and because this wasn't my stepfather's first time doing something like this. He got 5 years in prison, which felt like both too much and not enough at the same time. Too much because I still had some residual feelings of caring about him, and not enough because of what he'd put my mom and me through. The financial recovery was more complicated. While we were able to get the house sale reversed and get the property back, there were significant costs involved in the legal process. Plus, some of the money my stepfather had spent was just gone, particularly the cash he'd blown in Las Vegas and on other frivolous purchases. In the end, I recovered most of what was stolen, but the legal fees and other costs meant that I didn't come out financially whole. The emotional recovery has been much more difficult and is still ongoing. Losing my mom was hard enough, but having to deal with the betrayal and legal battle while I was grieving made the whole process so much more complicated. I found myself questioning every interaction I'd had with my stepfather over the years, wondering if there had been other signs I'd missed or other ways he'd been taking advantage of my mom. I also struggled with guilt about not protecting my mom better. Even though intellectually I knew there was no way I could have prevented what happened, emotionally, I felt like I should have been more suspicious or more involved in her affairs during her final months. The fact that he'd been planning this while she was dying made me feel like I'd failed her somehow. The house itself became a complicated symbol. On one hand, it was my mom's house and contained all the memories of the time I'd spent there with her. On the other hand, it was also the place where my stepfather had betrayed her, and being there sometimes brought back all the anger and pain from discovering what he'd done. I eventually decided to keep the house but to make significant changes to it, both to honor my mom's memory and to make it feel like a place where I could build new, positive memories. The whole experience changed my perspective on a lot of things. I became much more careful about trusting people, particularly when it comes to financial matters. I also became more involved in elder abuse prevention advocacy, because I realized how common this type of fraud is and how devastating it can be for families who are already dealing with loss and grief. Looking back now, I think the hardest part wasn't even the financial fraud, as awful as that was. The hardest part was having to accept that someone I'd considered family had been capable of such calculated cruelty. It forced me to confront the reality that people aren't always who they seem to be, and that even people who are supposed to love and care for you can sometimes have ulterior motives. But I also learned about resilience and the importance of trusting your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is, even if you can't immediately put your finger on what's bothering you. My mom's voice in my head, telling me to dig deeper and ask more questions, is what ultimately led to uncovering the truth. In a way, she was still protecting me even after she was gone. The experience also showed me the importance of having good legal and financial documentation. My mom's careful record-keeping, and the fact that she'd worked with an attorney to set up her will properly, is what made it possible to prove that the property transfer was fraudulent. Without that paper trail, it would have been much harder to challenge what my stepfather had done. Today, I'm living in my mom's house, which I've renovated and made my own while still keeping the elements that remind me of her. The kitchen still has her favorite coffee mug in the cabinet, and I still use the recipe box she kept on the counter. But I've also painted the walls different colors and rearranged the furniture to make it feel like my space, rather than just a museum of her memory. My stepfather was released from prison last year, and I occasionally wonder what he's doing now. Part of me hopes he's learned from what happened and is trying to make amends for the harm he caused. But mostly, I try not to think about him at all. He took enough from my mom and me during the worst time of our lives, and I refuse to let him continue to take up space in my head now. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect and care for you are the ones who end up hurting you the most. But it also taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was, and that I can survive even the most devastating betrayals. My mom raised me to stand up for myself and to fight for what's right, and in the end, that's exactly what I did.